Dear colleague, good morning. It is my grandmother's guest, Dr. Douglas DeLong. Dr. DeLong received his medical degree from the University of North California at traveled here, and his Bachelor of Art degree from Duke University. He then completed an internship and residency at the Bethesda Hospital in New York, and become the chief of division of general internal medicine at Bethesda Medical Center in Cooperstown, New York, and an associate clinical professor of medicine in the College of Physicians and Surgery at Columbia University. He has been a fellow of the American College of Physicians ACP since year 1994, and he served many important jobs at the ACP, including governor of New York's Hudson Valley chapter, and the chair of ACP's board of governors. In this year's annual meeting of ACP from April 11 to 13, he is selected as the chair of the board of regents of the ACP. The board of regents is the main policy-making body of the ACP. Today we are more than happy to have this lecture entitled Update on Medical Consequences of Climate Change. Please join me to give him a big welcome.
Is that going to be okay? Is that loud enough? Can you hear me? Good. First of all, I want to thank the kind introduction. I want to thank Professor Chang and the Society of Internal Medicine for inviting me. The reputation of the Taiwan Society of Internal Medicine is one of being very gracious hosts, and you've certainly done that during our trip, so thank you very much. And on behalf of the 159,000 members of the American College of Physicians, I bring you greetings. So today, you're going to not hear the same kind of talk that you just heard. This talk is going to be more of the other hemisphere of your brain. It tends to be more of a public health epidemiological talk, and one that I'm personally quite passionate about, and that's climate change and the medical consequences thereof. Backwards. So here are my disclosures and conflict of interest. Here are our objectives for today. I really don't intend to debate, because I doubt that there are very many people in this room who do not think that climate change is a real phenomenon. Hopefully I'm going to make the case over and over again that climate change is real, climate change is happening now, and we are the cause of it. We're going to talk a little bit about just some of the evidence for climate change. We'll review some of the consequences thereof, and then I'm going to propose some actions that all of us can do as individuals, and particularly as physician leaders. So here's the basis. Again, it's real, it's happening now, we're the cause, and I would suggest to you it's not hyperbole to suggest that this is the most important public health threat ever faced by the planet, and it is existential in nature. But although this talk is, I would say, somewhat sobering, I do think that there's lots of reasons to be optimistic that we still have a chance to do something about it, and as physicians we have a particular obligation to do so. So here is the Professor Dinosaur saying that the picture's pretty grim, the climate's changing, the mammals are taking over, and we have brains the size of a walnut. Hopefully we're better prepared than that, and we will do better than the dinosaurs did. So just briefly, greenhouse gases are actually a normal phenomenon. They have a protective blanket around the planet. Without the greenhouse gases, we would not be able to survive on this planet. But as the atmosphere heats up and the concentration of CO2 and nitrogen oxide increase, then the temperature in the lower atmosphere rises, and that causes global warming. You all knew that. So it's already happening now. The data is really and truly unequivocal. We've been seeing it, people have been warning about it for more than half a century now, and it really is completely unprecedented. Both the atmosphere and the oceans have warmed. The snow and ice are diminishing throughout the world's sea level is rising, and the concentration of greenhouse gases have increased significantly. And that's from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2013. There's been several updates since that time, but have done nothing more than just emphasize the importance of that. And this is just some data that came from a observatory in Hawaii, where since over the last 30 or 40 years, that you can see the concentration of CO2 is increasing. Clearly, this is related to our use of fossil fuels, and in particular, it's carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, which are the ones that are increasing so greatly, and in particular, carbon dioxide being probably the most important contributor to climate change. One can see going back over 100 years that there have been a number of models that have projected potential for climate change, and the data has actually been pretty close to what the models would suggest in the pink there. So the climate scientists really do have a good handle on this, and it's quite clear that we're headed in the wrong direction. All right, so what about some of the indicators? First of all, the temperature at the surface of the Earth has already increased by 0.8 degrees Celsius just over since the Industrial Revolution. And at least the northern hemisphere, in the last 20 years, there's been the warmest 30-year period in the last 1,400 years, and 2016 was the hottest year on record, and the 2019 earliest data would suggest it's likely to be the second highest ever recorded temperature ever. Sea and ice is dwindling. This is the Muir Glacier in Alaska in 1941, and as it is seen today, it's a fairly dramatic picture. Also very worrisome to scientists, of course, are the massive amounts of ice that are trapped in Greenland and on Antarctica, and the consequences of those collapsing would be catastrophic. This gets to be somewhat personally important for me. I had an ancestor, Lieutenant George Washington DeLong, who was an Arctic explorer, who had a Shackleton-type adventure in the Bering Sea, but it didn't turn out as well. They were trapped in the ice. They floated around for about a year and a half in the 1880s. The ship was crushed. They went overland to over the ice and ended up in Siberia, where my ancestor froze to death, kept a Shackleton-type diary right up until the end. And where he, at that time, was trapped in the ice just in the 1880s, that is now ice-free year-round. So sea levels are rising. We know that it's already risen about 8 inches since the beginning of this century. And it's because of both the warmer oceans, which absorbs more heat, and water expands, of course, with more heat, and also the melting of the ice that we just saw. So what would Taiwan look like in 2100 hours, the year 2100? So this is a projection of what a 1 meter rise in sea level would look like. So if I'm not mistaken, we're kind of here somewhere. So Taipei would be not affected so badly, but other cities closer to the coast, I think that's the current coastline now of Yilan, if I'm pronouncing that even close to correctly. But you can see it's going to have significant effects. As we were driving around with our tour guide, our lovely tour guide, last couple of days, we saw some, along the river, there were some concrete barriers for the storm surges, and those would be completely submerged in this situation. So that's what potentially lies ahead of us. So what does this have to do with health? We're all physicians. The answer is everything. So this is probably the only slide that you would need to do is a takeaway for this entire talk. So heat begets worsening and more severe storms. Let me start in the middle here. So rising temperatures lead to extreme weather events. So more intense and more frequent storms, which leads to rising sea levels, which it leads to rising CO2 levels. The rising temperatures cause heat and heat-related illnesses. It increases the weather, which causes physical effects. Increasing air pollution causes cardiovascular and pulmonary effects. Vectors cause all sorts of infectious diseases. Increasing allergens lead to more respiratory symptoms. Problems with water, both too much and too little, can lead to waterborne illnesses, and malnutrition and disease states, and then just further environmental degradation, which can lead to mass migration and other issues. So that's really the crux of the talk in one slide, and we'll deal with all those very briefly in just now. So let's first of all talk about heat. This is data that would suggest that 4 years ago, just looking back about temperatures, here's where I live, upstate New York, in this little village of 2,000 people. Our temperature really hasn't changed that much in the last few decades. Here's Taiwan, much worse temperature. So I don't know if you've all been feeling that. I understand that it's quite warm and humid here in the summertime. Well, be prepared, it's going to be more warm and more humid coming up. So heat-related stresses, there are some studies that would suggest that extreme heat events, which used to just occur infrequently, will now be happening every other year. Remind you that back in 2003, there was a severe heat wave in Europe where thousands of people died, particularly in France. And like most heat waves, it's the most vulnerable in our populations that has happened to, so that the elderly, children, and urban dwellers. I imagine that Taipei has plenty of the elderly and urban dwellers and vulnerable children as well. So here's just a quick review of the pathophysiology of heat-related disorders. So the heat stroke, greater than 40 degrees centigrade, with CNF dysfunction and leading to multiple organ failure. Heat exhaustion with a normal core temperature, but manifests as fatigue, tachycardia, diaphoresis. Heat syncope with you can have a normal core temperature, but I would consider that more of the common faint. And then there's heat tetany, a term that I actually had never heard of previously, but it causes carpal pedal spasm, paresthesia, and hyperventilation. And again, it's the individuals that are young, the old, people of low socioeconomic status, previous history of heat stroke, or outdoor laborers. And heat stroke itself, again, it's 40 degrees centigrade, and that leads to a cascading event of pathophysiology with damages to the cell metabolism, acid-base balance, eventually causing rhabdomyolysis, injury to the vascular endothelium, which eventually ends up with a systemic inflammatory response, decreased organ blood flow, and the treatment is rapid cooling, maybe immersion in cold water, There are probably people in this room who have more experience than I with this, but that's what the data would suggest we should do. You want to stop when the temperature is around 38 so you don't overshoot. And then it's still debatable exactly what sort of fluid resuscitation you might want to use, whether that's lactated ringers or just colloid. Air pollution. This is something I picked up off the web. This is mainland China and one of their relatively frequent smog alerts. So air pollution, you can divide that into multiple different areas. The amount of CO2, non-CO2, and also particulate matter. The increasing problems with air quality leads to increase of rates and severity of asthma, increased cardiovascular events, actually myocardial infarctions, increased incidence of COPD, and we'll go into this a little bit more, maybe even some incidence of increased cognitive failure. So Jen, just to kind of go over the pathophysiology again, higher temperatures and increased CO2 cause increased pollen loads, leads to increasing respiratory problems. The ozone can directly affect lung function. It's estimated in 2012, 7 million deaths were connected to outdoor ambient air pollution and household indoor air pollution. Pollen season is getting longer in my part of the world, so we see more allergy-related phenomenon and asthma. The CO2 may actually, plants use CO2 for their metabolism, might actually increase the growth of allergen-producing weeds, grasses, trees, and fungi, again exacerbating allergies. And then either heavy rainfall and flooding can cause indoor mold growth and fungi. So lots of potentials there. Particulate matter. This is I was trying to, as much as possible, make this talk germane to this audience, and so this was a article in the Lancet by a number of local authors listed there, and they studied a very large number of individuals and found that, not surprisingly, long-term exposure, this is over years, that particulate matter greater than 2.5 microns led to both reduced lung function and a faster decline over time. And there was also an increased risk in actual diagnosis of chronic obstructive lung disease. Air pollution and cognitive function. This was just a relatively new paper that was new to me, suggesting that it is possible that just having been exposed to chronic air pollution can lead to cognitive decline. Changing in the vectors. So I believe this is Aedes aegypti mosquito. Could be corrected if there's an entomologist in the room. But I know this other one on the right very well. I've spent virtually all of my career in places where Lyme disease has been endemic. This is the black-legged tick. It's spreading north throughout the eastern United States and becoming extremely common. Where I've lived, if you see someone that comes in with a peripheral facial palsy, that's Lyme disease until proven otherwise. So we know that it's now these climate-sensitive vectors, and they're also spreading dengue and chikungunya. I've not personally seen chikungunya, but I keep looking for it. I understand dengue has become really very common in Southeast Asia. I was shocked by this other statement that it looks like Lyme disease is extending up into Canada now, of all places. We also know that there are waterborne diseases that can thrive, like cholera, in places where water is either scarce or even too much. So we're seeing increased instances of cholera as well. So this is sort of a general summary, but by no means complete, of the possibility of infectious diseases related to climate change. So mosquitoes, we talked about malaria, dengue, Zika, ticks, so this tick-borne encephalitis, Lyme disease. There are also a huge number of, mainland China apparently has a large number of tick-related illnesses, many of which were new to me. I did not see very many associated with Taiwan, but I'd be loved to hear if anybody has experience with that. and many other diseases likewise that are probably less common. So this was a study that I was just talked about a little bit in China, and there's also been a new virus that was, this was in the New England Journal of Medicine just recently, about a new virus that had been found related to ticks. There are a huge number of expanding pathogens that we've now seen in the United States related to tick-related illnesses. This is what I found kind of fascinating. So I would love to know if anybody in the room has seen a case of Candida auris yet. Lots. Okay, so I have not personally, but this really scares me greatly. So Candida auris, for those of you who are not familiar with, is a new universally drug-resistant fungal species that was first reported just 10 years ago. Now it's worldwide. It arose independently on 3 different continents, and it's clonal, but they're genetically distinct, so it came from, spread very rapidly. And one of the theories, and I'll have a cartoon in just a moment, is that there's a concept of a thermal restriction zone. So mammals have been theoretically protected because of our high body temperatures from the invasion of certain fungal species who do not tolerate high temperatures. So this is again, this cartoon which suggests that global climate change has led to increased temperature and salinity of wetlands, which has selected out this species of fungi which are now tolerant to higher temperatures. It's postulated that birds, migratory birds, have spread it across the world, mainly into rural environments, which then gets into the city and into our hospitals. That's complete conjecture, of course, but it does make some sense. Water. So lots of issues related to both food and waterborne diseases. We touched a little bit on Vibrio. There was a big outbreak of cryptosporidiosis in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, not that many years ago. We see a lot of Campylobacter. I personally see less of these. Some of the algae blooms that are around the world are related to heat for sure. Food security is obviously going to be a big deal as the climate changes. It's recommended that, or it's estimated right now that the climate change could result in up to 20% of people across the world at risk of chronic hunger. That's a pretty staggering number, it seems to me. And water scarcity has become more the norm, with 100 million additional urban dwellers experiencing perennial water shortages. 100 million. Okay, so this also caught my attention. Apparently, barley, which is the main ingredient of beer, they're projecting that with climate change, the production could decrease from 13 to 17%. I couldn't resist putting that one in there, sorry. So the extreme weather events are going to be becoming more common. We've talked about that a little bit. This is I'm sorry, again. This is a picture of hurricane, the one that just hit Japan. Here's, I believe that's Taiwan there. So they're becoming more and more common, more and more fierce super typhoons, etc. In the United States, probably many people were heard about the Hurricane Katrina and the devastation that it caused there. So I'm going to try and make the case again that we as physicians have a special obligation to talk up about climate change and to teach each of us ourselves and to teach each other and to teach our patients about the consequences. Here's some comments from 3 different medical groups. I really want to comment though on the American Medical Association. So the American Medical Association, for those of you not as familiar with the AMA, is not the most progressive liberal organization on the planet, and fairly conservative. And this statement that the Earth is undergoing adverse global climate change and that anthropogenic contributions are significant, and climate change will create conditions that affect public health with disproportionate impacts on vulnerable populations, including children, the elderly, and the poor. For the American Medical Association to make that statement, that's a big deal. So I'm particularly pleased as an individual physician to some years ago write a resolution that I took to the college that became a policy paper and now has led to talks like this throughout the world. So this was an idea, a resolution, made it through our process, and now is American College of Physicians actual policy. So this needs to be a global effort. That's one of the reasons that I'm here talking to you today. We do need to recognize, we'll talk a little bit about this more in a minute, our own contributions to greenhouse emissions. And I don't mean just us as individuals, but I mean us as a medical community. And we need to also recognize adaptation strategy and mitigation measures as well. So adaptation, this is just dealing with the here and now. There's already 1.5 degrees centigrade heat baked into the current system. So that's not avoidable. We're going to have to adapt to that. So there are many things that we can do, but adaptation is really just that, and it's not going to help us get out of this problem. So it really needs to be, most of the focus needs to be on mitigation, and that's to either stop or reverse possibly the effects that we're seeing now. We really need to get to a carbon neutral energy source. We need to decrease deforestation and increase reforestation, and we all need to make lifestyle and behavioral changes. You all knew that too. But it's the great thing is that this is a win-win situation. For all the things we just talked about, they have a positive effect on health, just as opposed to, in addition to being just something that we have to do to save the planet. So we know that decreasing, lower emissions will lead to a decrease in heart disease, strokes, dementia, possibly, and maybe depression. And that decreasing coal-generated electricity likewise will decrease the particulate matter and the respiratory illnesses. So there are plenty of opportunities going forward. This is not all doom and gloom. So the Lancet Commission on Climate Change and Health had a significant report out in 2015. Again, that we're feeling this today, and future projections represent an unacceptably high and potential catastrophic risk to human health. This was just updated this year, and I picked out just a couple of sentences that jumped out at me. The life of every child born today will be profoundly affected. So I mentioned in my conflict of interest, I have 5 grandchildren. I look around this room. There are many people in this room that have grandchildren. There are probably other people who have children, and there are other people who will have children. And we really need to think about them. And this does represent an unprecedented challenge, which will require an unprecedented response. So healthcare industry actually is one of the bigger drivers of climate change. This was entirely new to me. We are second in energy use after the food industry. In the United States alone, we create 2.3 million tons of garbage and waste per year. So at ACP, one of our recommendations that in the healthcare sector that we must invent environmentally sustainable and energy efficient practices and prepare for impacts of climate change. So I'm from the state of New York. Hurricane Sandy was a few years ago. It was a complete disaster because many of the hospitals had their critical equipment in the basements, just not where you would want to have them when you're going to have a flood. I'm assuming here in Taipei, you're used to typhoons and dealing with severe weather, that you've already made those changes. I've seen around the campus here, just a little bit of walking, there are signs about energy conservation. So I suspect that you are well ahead of what we're doing in the United States, and I applaud you for that. So you can green your facility if you're in the process of building something new. There are healthcare systems that have gone 100% carbon neutral. So the Gunderson Clinic in La Crosse, Wisconsin, is completely free of fossil fuels as a supply itself with energy. Green transportation, so using more efficient transportation, using mass transport, using telecommunication, using local suppliers. We can all use, just like in our own homes, you're probably already doing this, in our buildings, we can use more efficient light bulbs, cut the heat down, solar panels, and reducing standby energy use. I think most people probably don't know that when they turn their computers off at night, they're still consuming a huge amount of energy, so you really do need to unplug them or connect it to well, you need to unplug them. In building, I touched on that. I'm not going to go over that. We need to recycle and buy recycled products. And again, this was relatively new to me, but anesthetic gases also contribute to global climate change. And we do need to be much better at collecting and recycling, particularly nitrous oxide and other anesthetic gases, which are very toxic to the environment. In food service, the college, we just published a paper in the Annals talking about the consumption of meat. I'm not sure if anybody's seen that, but it generated a lot of local controversy. But eating less meat, of course, is good for the planet, because the production of methane by cattle, and also just the use of land for protein is less efficient than crops. We should buy local and seasonal food, compost. And then here's the big one. I would say that we need to be much better advocates. So again, it's real, we're causing it, it's bad for us, we need to take action now. The climate's already changing, people are already being harmed right now. You all have patients in your offices that you see. So here's your to-do list today. You need to educate yourself, so hopefully you learned a little something today, and you can go back and educate your community and your patients. You can be green. You can support International Relief Agency as part of adaptation. You can agitate as professional societies. We can all become advocates for climate change. And we really need to legislate, because that's where all the power is, of course, so both at the state, national, and international levels. There's our planet. It's a beautiful place. And this is my grandchildren. And with that, sachet.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive about climate change and our health. We still have time. Is any question or comment? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. You are very excellent. I'm much very impressed. I think climate change is really a global,
yes.
issue, threat of health. So I want to add one. I show you a cartoon very interesting about weather. The weather is dry, and the birds, oh, no weather. That's right. So fly to the land, even the city. I think it is one of the reasons why the avian flu. Usually, the weather birds, have living in the wetland. Now, wetland is lost, so they are fly in there, and mixed with the kitchen farm.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe the weather bird has this strong immunity to the influenza virus.
Right.
For the farm, the chicken in the farm, it's a bit weird, So then maybe cause the avian flu in a chicken farm. So this is I saw your cartoon, and then I have this thinking and reflection. Okay, I just want to add this to your lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And you're right. I didn't talk about influenza. That I have infectious disease friends that the changing migratory pattern of birds really scares them, because we all know that we're overdue for a pandemic of influenza. It's just a matter of time. And perhaps some of the climate change issues, because winter migration patterns for birds has been changing. Obviously, we don't know exactly why, but I expect water has a lot to do with it, and temperatures.
And you also mentioned dengue fever is about the climate change. Firstly, when I was young, I have fear of winter season. Winter is cold, but now in Taiwan, we all have a warm winter. Now in the winter season, we are very warm, And this much related to the dengue fever epidemic. Each year we have this epidemic. But if we have a cold winter, then the dengue epidemic will start in the winter.
Mm-hmm.
But now, the winter, the dengue fever almost, have cases year one.
Presumably related to the, the vectors that can still fly. Yeah.
Yeah, because the Aedes, feel very, very comfortable for one winter.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
Any other question or comment?
I think I see one in the way back.
Yeah. Please give him a microphone.
Hi, thank you, Doctor, for giving such a wonderful speech on climate change and healthcare. I think this is a very important topic to bring up among the healthcare. I just have a few thoughts. One of it is that in medical, we focus on the aseptic techniques and all. So it has come to a point that we prefer single-use tools or sets instead of using re-sterilized items, such as the surgical gowns or the dress, certain kits that we use for procedures. I think that is one thing that we can do a little bit more about it on the single-use kits to help reduce plastics use and all those. And another point that I'd like to thank you for bringing it up is that the plant-based diet. I think that is another important point to focus on. For example, I've been a vegetarian for more than 10 years, and I found that the health benefits is definitely there. So I would like to thank you for bringing it up today. Thank you.
Thank you. So you emphasized the point about the waste in our medical system. It's really quite large, and we need to do something about it. So that would be one good place to start with the single-use things. And meat consumption is another one of those win-win things. So it's good for the planet. It's probably good for ourselves as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We also, apart from the recyclable gowns, for example, have improved the curtains in the hospital, where you have even a low impact on infection spread. But these curtains can be kept for 3 months. You don't have to keep watching them. They are very easily recycled, and they also, from an antibiotic stewardship point of view, useful. And the second thing, just a point about being female with this heated climate and being menopausal is not a joke.
No comment.
Any other question or comment? If there are no further questions, I will present appreciation for his outstanding talk.
Thank you.
thanks to the speakers this morning give us two very wonderful lectures, and I believe everybody enjoyed their talk. And please give them a big applause to say appreciate their help.